In 2025, archaeology didn't just find new artifacts. It destroyed old certainties. 10 myths once printed in textbooks, gone. Cleopatra's lost sister never existed. The Maya collapse never happened. Rome's massacre in Britain? Fiction. Because every time we dig deeper, the story changes, and the past becomes less about glory, more about correction. So today, we're not uncovering treasure. We're digging up mistakes and the people who built them. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. For centuries, history was written like scripture, unchallenged, orderly, sealed in ink. But the ground never obeyed the ink. Beneath the marble and the ruins, new instruments kept whispering contradictions. DNA sequencing, isotopic mapping, drone scanning, tools that don't bow to legend. And in 2025, those tools didn't just rewrite footnotes, they overturned foundations. It began in Egypt. For years, a skull in the octagon tomb at Ephesus was hailed as Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe IV, proof of royal African ancestry and evidence of dynastic intrigue. The story filled documentaries, lectures, and online debates. But when scientists re-examined the remains with radiocarbon and genetic testing, the truth surfaced. The skull wasn't a woman's at all. It belonged to a boy, 11 to 14 years old, from the Mediterranean. One test, one sequence, a decade of speculation, gone. The same year, the myth of the Maya apocalypse crumbled next. For generations, we were told their cities fell all at once, swallowed by drought and mystery. But new settlement modeling and DNA analysis revealed something quieter, more human. The Maya world didn't end. It adapted. Some cities declined, others thrived. People moved, merged, rebuilt. The collapse was not a night of doom, but centuries of change. The ruins we once mourned were not graves, but blueprints for survival. Then, Britain's national legend took its turn. The Roman massacre at Maiden Castle, a story retold for nearly a century, dissolved under fresh carbon dating. The burials were scattered across generations, not a single bloody siege. What we mistook for conquest was closer to community. Small conflicts, slow decay, ordinary deaths stretched across time. The Romans didn't script the tragedy. Modern historians did. One by one, the stories broke open. And through every fracture, the same truth appeared. History's power has always rested not on evidence, but on narrative, on who gets to speak and who remains silent beneath the soil. 2024 proved that archaeology isn't just about discovery, it's about accountability. Because every broken myth exposes not just what the ancients believed, but what we needed them to believe. The past didn't fail us, we failed to listen. For more than a decade, one skull defined the face of Cleopatra's family. When the BBC aired Cleopatra, Portrait of a Killer, in 2009, it offered an irresistible story. The skull of a young woman found in the octagon tomb at Ephesus was claimed to belong to Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe IV. It was everything a network could want: a royal scandal, a genetic revelation, and a hint of race and identity layered over empire and murder. The idea spread faster than any academic paper could contain it. Articles declared, Cleopatra's African heritage proven by science. Museums adjusted their exhibits. The internet repeated it until the claim hardened into fact. But the skull was lying. In early 2025, a research team re-examined the same remains using methods unavailable in 2009. Full genomic sequencing, improved radiocarbon calibration, and isotopic sourcing. The results dismantled the story from the ground up. The skeleton wasn't that of a woman, and certainly not a royal. It belonged to one individual, a boy, perhaps 11 to 14 years old, whose ancestry traced not to North Africa, but to the Italian peninsula or Sardinia. Every test confirmed the same verdict. The connection to Cleopatra's dynasty was impossible. The study, published in scientific reports, was blunt. There was no royal tomb, no lost sister, no mixed ancestry. The Austrian Academy of Sciences summarized it in one quiet line: Cleopatra's sister remains missing. Yet the collapse of the claim revealed something deeper than a simple scientific correction. It exposed how desperately modern culture wants the past to validate its narratives. The 2009 documentary had never been purely about archaeology. It was about identity, legacy, and ownership of history. To many, the African ancestry claim was not a curiosity. It was a declaration of pride. The skeleton's story became political property. When that myth dissolved, so did a comfort. The reaction was swift, defensive, and familiar. Comment sections accused the scientists of whitewashing. Others claimed the tomb had been tampered with. Few accepted that evidence could be both neutral and inconvenient. The skull no longer belonged to Cleopatra. It belonged to everyone's need to be right. What the 2025 team uncovered then was more than a misidentified body. They uncovered the anatomy of modern myth-making. Because archaeology doesn't just reconstruct the ancient world, it mirrors the present one. Each generation asks the past to tell a story that flatters its fears, its pride, or its politics. And every so often, the data refuses. The bones in the octagon tomb did exactly that. For over a century, Cleopatra has been one of the most reinterpreted figures in history. To Rome, she was a temptress who corrupted Julius Caesar. To Shakespeare, she was tragic grandeur. To Hollywood, she was exotic spectacle. And in the 21st century, she became an argument about race, empire, and representation. In each version, she reflected not herself, but the anxieties of the world describing her. The sister's skull was simply the latest mask, a modern artifact of our obsession with visibility and bloodline. The 2025 study didn't destroy Cleopatra's legend, it purified it. It separated her from our projections and returned her to the one place we rarely look: the historical record itself. There, she is neither white nor black, neither goddess nor villain. She is a ruler navigating survival in a collapsing world, a woman of extraordinary intelligence caught between empire and extinction. The bones of an anonymous child can't speak for her, but they can remind us how easily we let fiction fill silence. Archaeology has always lived at the border between science and story. The tension between them is what makes it seductive. A fragment of skull can rewrite centuries. A mislabeled grave can alter identity. But the same power that reveals truth can manufacture illusion. The question is never just what we find, it's what we want it to mean. The case of Arsinoe's skull forces us to face an uncomfortable reality. Evidence alone can't save history. It can only offer correction. The rest depends on whether we are willing to accept it. Because even when the data is irrefutable, belief has its own gravity. Once a myth aligns with a social need, pride, grievance, glory, no amount of sequencing can fully erase it. That is why myths endure long after their evidence has died. They feed the emotional economies of the living. In 2025, the scientists provided closure, but the public demanded resurrection. The skull may have been buried again, but the debate lived on. Proof that truth itself now competes for relevance. This first correction of the year set the tone for everything that followed. Each new discovery carried the same quiet violence, stripping away comfort to reveal complication. In the months ahead, the same process would repeat. In the jungles of Belize, in the hills of Dorset, in the sands of Egypt, each site whispered the same message: the past isn't vanishing, it's correcting us. Because the danger was never that we knew too little, but that we loved our myths too much. For more than a century, the story of the Maya collapse has been one of archaeology's greatest tragedies. In every documentary, the narrative is the same. Around the year 900, mighty cities, Tikal, Palenque, Copan, fell silent overnight. Temples swallowed by jungle, thrones abandoned, an entire civilization erased in a single mysterious disaster. It was beautiful storytelling, clean, cinematic, and false. In 2025, that myth finally broke apart. 3 major studies published that year, combining radiocarbon modeling, settlement archaeology, and ancient DNA, exposed the truth. The Maya didn't collapse, they changed. One of those papers, in radiocarbon, used Bayesian modeling to track the rise and fall of settlements in east-central Belize. The data showed staggering variation. Some cities were shrinking, others were expanding. While one dynasty faced drought, another was building new reservoirs. There was no synchronized disaster, only a slow, region-by-region reorganization. Civilization didn't end, it adapted. Another team compared isotopic data and pollen cores to climate records. Yes, droughts came, but not everywhere, not at once. The environment was harsh, yet communities found ways to endure. Irrigation canals, migration, trade realignment. In some places, local power even grew stronger after 900 CE. A third study in current biology analyzed the DNA of individuals across the Classic period. The genetic record was unmistakable: continuity, not extinction. Lineages persisted for centuries. Families intermarried, moved, and rebuilt under new names. What we call collapse was, in their own lives, transition. The findings weren't just scientific corrections, they were moral ones. Because every time we speak of a civilization disappearing, we erase the people who lived through it. The Maya didn't vanish into jungle mist. Their descendants still walk the same soil, speak related languages, and remember through ritual what the textbooks once declared old. So how did the myth survive for so long? Partly because simplicity sells. A single catastrophe is easier to dramatize than centuries of resilience. Western archaeology, especially in its early decades, loved tidy endings, apocalypses that mirrored our fears of decline. The collapse narrative turned the Maya into cautionary ghosts, proof that even great societies could destroy themselves. It was moral theatre, not evidence. But the new data forced a different picture, one that replaced tragedy with endurance. The supposed fall of the Maya world was not a moment of death, but a redistribution of life. Populations moved north, economies shifted, beliefs evolved. The same cities that we call ruins were, for generations, waypoints in a network of survival. At Tikal, carbon dates showed construction continuing long after the collapse date taught in schools. At Lamanai, trade ceramics from centuries later proved continuous contact with coastal markets. These weren't abandoned citadels, they were evolving systems. What decayed in one place blossomed in another. The myth's persistence also revealed a deeper bias, the colonial habit of confusing transformation with failure. For centuries, European scholars described indigenous change as loss. Adaptation was framed as decline, endurance as evidence of inferiority. But 2025 finally allowed the data to speak without apology. The Maya world did not fall. It shifted form, just as all living cultures do. The implications reach beyond Central America. They challenge how we talk about our own civilization. When we imagine apocalypse, we often project our fears onto the past. The collapse of the Maya reassured us that complexity is fragile, that environmental crisis equals extinction. But the evidence says otherwise. Societies bend, absorb, reinvent. The Maya didn't teach us how to die. They taught us how to last. In one sense, this is what archaeology has always struggled to accept. That survival rarely looks glorious. It's not marble or empire. It's migration, adaptation, compromise. That's why their story was rewritten into something more dramatic. A sudden collapse feels meaningful. Gradual resilience feels mundane. But the dirt disagreed. The pollen, the bones, the genetic continuity, none of it supported the apocalypse we wanted. 2025 forced the field to confront a quiet truth. The ancient world was not a morality play written for modern audiences. It was a continuum of struggle and invention, as alive and uneven as our own. When those studies dropped, archaeologists called it the death of the collapse narrative. But perhaps it was something gentler, a correction, a long-delayed apology. Because the Maya never asked to be remembered as victims of fate. They endured drought, war, and political fragmentation not by vanishing, but by becoming something new. So when we look at their pyramids today, half devoured by vines, we aren't staring at ruins of a dead world. We're seeing the architecture of persistence, stone holding memory, not mourning. History's favorite disaster turned out to be its quietest victory. For decades, a barren hillside in Peru has divided the scientific world. Stretching more than a kilometer across the ridge of Monte Sierpa, thousands of identical pits, some wide, some shallow, dot the slope in perfectly straight rows. To early explorers, it looked like a scar left by gods or machines. To conspiracy theorists, it was a runway for aliens. And to the public, it was one of archaeology's favorite mysteries, the Band of Holes. But in 2025, that mystery was finally dismantled, not by speculation, but by evidence. A multinational team used drone mapping, sediment analysis, and microbotanical sampling to decode what generations of archaeologists had only guessed at. The results, published that year, revealed not a cosmic code or ritual site, but something far more human, and in many ways, more impressive. The Band of Holes, it turns out, wasn't a monument to mystery at all. It was infrastructure. Each depression had once served a function in a vast indigenous system of storage and accounting. By reconstructing soil layers and microscopic plant residues, the team found traces of maize, quinoa, and root crops. Proof that these pits once held and sorted food. The spacing between them was deliberate, standardized, and aligned with known Inca and pre-Inca systems of tallying and redistribution. In other words, Monte Sierpe wasn't a shrine, it was a ledger carved into stone. The revelation didn't fit easily into modern imaginations. After all, mystery sells, management doesn't. A supernatural runway draws millions of clicks. A prehistoric warehouse doesn't. But the science refused to flatter fantasy. Radiocarbon dating placed the site between 800 and 1400 CE, centuries before Spanish arrival, when local Andean communities built sophisticated networks for storing and moving goods. Each hole may have represented a family's quota, a delivery unit, or a counted measure of tribute. The band wasn't decoration, it was administration. That difference matters, because for years, popular culture has loved the image of the mysterious ancient genius, builders who could carve stones, but somehow left no bureaucracy. The 2025 discovery stripped that illusion bare. It showed that organization, not mysticism, was the root of ancient power. The brilliance of the Andes lay not in lost technology, but in logistics. The drones revealed something else: precision. The pits followed a consistent pattern that mirrored the modular logic of Inca quipu cords, the knotted strings once used for record keeping. Archaeologists now suspect that Monte Sierpe was a physical extension of that data system, a terrain-scale calculator for counting production and tribute. Where we saw chaos, they had engineered clarity. The myth of the unknown builders had lasted so long because it was comfortable. It allowed colonial narratives to persist, that indigenous societies needed external help to achieve order. Alien theories filled that void with spectacle, offering wonder without respect. But the 2025 study returned dignity where fantasy had stolen it. The Band of Holes was not a cosmic mystery waiting for outsiders to solve. It was evidence of an indigenous intelligence that measured the world in maize and labor, not miracles. The reaction, as always, was divided. Some welcomed the findings as long overdue recognition. Others lamented that another great mystery had been ruined. But, in reality, nothing was ruined, only restored. The work at Monte Sierpe didn't take magic away from the past. It placed it back in human hands. It also exposed a persistent flaw in how we approach archaeology, our obsession with astonishment over accuracy. We crave secrets, not systems. We want the extraordinary, even when the ordinary built empires. The Band of Holes forces a question that echoes through every excavation. Do we study the past to understand people, or to entertain ourselves? For the researchers, the answer was clear. The site's geometry wasn't designed to impress. It was meant to function. And in that function lies something deeper than mystery: continuity. It shows how order, economy, and cooperation shaped the pre-Columbian world as much as any ritual or war. When the data was published, one line stood out. Monte Sierpe represents an indigenous landscape of measurement and distribution. In those words, an entire mythology collapsed. The hillside that once seemed to hold secrets of gods turned out to be a monument to accountability. A civilization had carved its spreadsheets into stone, and for once, the truth was greater than the myth. Because what the Band of Holes teaches us is simple. Mystery fades, but structure endures. And sometimes, the most extraordinary thing about the ancient world is that it worked. For years, the mounds of Poverty Point in northeast Louisiana stood as a paradox. Massive, concentric ridges, some stretching nearly a mile wide, and earthen mounds towering over the floodplain. All built 3,500 years ago by people with no metal tools, no wheels, and supposedly no leaders. To early archaeologists, that combination was unthinkable. A structure of that scale had to mean hierarchy. Kings, chiefs, priests, directing armies of laborers. The textbooks were clear. Only an organized state could have moved that much earth. But in 2025, a new wave of research flipped that certainty on its head. A study in southeastern archaeology re-examined settlement layers, soil composition, and artifact distribution around the site. Its conclusion was simple, yet revolutionary. Poverty Point wasn't a capital city. It was a gathering ground. The builders weren't a subjugated workforce. They were visitors. Hunter-gatherers, families, traders, and neighbors converge seasonally to work together, feast and trade, before dispersing again. What had looked like the seat of an ancient kingdom was, in truth, a festival of cooperation. Sediment analysis revealed episodic construction, short, intense bursts of labor separated by long intervals of absence. There were no permanent houses for elites, no temples enforcing devotion, no cemeteries of ruling families. What archaeologists once mistook for administrative planning was instead communal rhythm. People returning each year to reshape their landscape, not under orders, but out of shared ritual. It changed everything we thought we knew about complexity. The new evidence showed that monumental building didn't require tyranny. Organization could exist without domination. Order could emerge from consensus. The mounds were not proof of an early state. They were proof that equality can build as much as power. Researchers used the phrase episodic monumentality. It describes something profound. Large-scale projects achieved through repeated gatherings of free people, not enslaved or taxed subjects. The labor was voluntary, perhaps sacred, a social contract written in clay. And yet, for over a century, the field had refused to see it. Because hierarchy, in our imagination, is the default explanation for greatness. We struggle to believe that coordination can exist without coercion. The 2025 reinterpretation of Poverty Point didn't just rewrite a site. It rewired archaeology's psychology. It forced a confrontation with a question as old as civilization itself. Do we build because we're ruled, or do we rule because we can build? Every mound, every ridge, became a symbol of an invisible democracy. Imagine hundreds of people arriving each season, not to obey, but to participate. Their tools simple: baskets, spades, woven mats. Their motivation collective: to raise earth, to feast, to reaffirm belonging. No overseers, no military enforcement, no palaces. When the project was done, they left. The mounds remained, quiet testaments to cooperation that modern power still struggles to replicate. The discovery resonated far beyond Louisiana. It challenged the way we measure progress itself. For 2 centuries, archaeologists equated big with advanced, organized with ruled. But Poverty Point asked something more radical. What if the opposite is true? What if freedom, not authority, was civilization's original engine? Artifacts unearthed at the site supported that idea. Obsidian from the Rockies, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf, trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers. A world without kings still managed to connect half a continent. That wasn't chaos. It was coordination by trust. When the 2025 study was published, its authors warned against the arrogance of state worship in archaeology. The tendency to see every great structure as evidence of command, not cooperation. Their words cut deep. The scale of human organization cannot be measured by hierarchy alone. For the modern viewer, it's humbling, because we've inherited the opposite assumption, that order requires obedience, and power must sit atop a pyramid. Poverty Point shows another geometry: circles, not tiers, gatherings, not regimes. Under that reading, those massive earthworks stop being primitive anomalies. They become philosophies of community written in soil. Every curve and ridge is the signature of shared will. Thousands of hands moving together, not for empire, but for memory. In 2025, archaeologists didn't just reclassify a site. They uncovered proof that civilization's blueprint might have begun without rulers at all. Maybe that's why the discovery felt quietly revolutionary, because it asked an uncomfortable question. If the ancients could build wonders without masters, what excuse do we have now? For decades, one of the most controversial theories in archaeology claimed that the first Americans didn't come from Asia, but from Europe. It was called the Solutrean hypothesis, and it told a story designed to thrill and divide. That during the Ice Age, Stone Age Europeans had somehow crossed the Atlantic, bringing their tools and their bloodlines to the New World. The idea sounded outrageous, but it had a powerful appeal. It placed Europe, once again, at the root of civilization. It gave history a white genesis, and for years it lingered in documentaries, forums, and nationalist manifestos, a myth dressed in the language of discovery. Then came 2025. That year, 2 major genetic studies, one in Science, another in Nature, dealt the Solutrean myth its final merciless blow. The first paper examined over 1,500 ancient genomes from across northern Eurasia and the Americas. The results were definitive. Every founding population in the Western Hemisphere traced back not to Europe, but to Northeast Asia. The divergence dates matched perfectly with the Beringian migration window, the land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. And crucially, not one genome carried a European signature, not a fragment, not even a statistical whisper. If the Solutrean migration had happened, its DNA would still echo somewhere, but the record was silent. The second study, published in Nature, drove the last nail in the coffin. It analyzed remains from central Argentina, individuals who had lived in isolation for 8,000 years. Their genetic heritage was a time capsule, untouched by later migrations. And even there, deep in the genetic past, the ancestry still traced entirely to Asia. No Solutrean lineage, no secret European link. For scientists, the verdict was clear. The Solutrean hypothesis was finished. But for many others, It was heresy, because myths built on pride die harder than myths built on faith. The theory's persistence had little to do with data and everything to do with psychology. It emerged in the mid-20th century when European archaeologists, facing evidence of indigenous sophistication, looked for ways to reinsert themselves into the origin story. If the Americas could be traced back to Paleolithic Europe, then even the New World's brilliance could be claimed as an inheritance. It was not science. It was nostalgia disguised as evidence. The 2.5 findings didn't just refute a migration, they exposed a motive. The Solutrean myth survived because it comforted those uneasy with the idea that indigenous civilizations achieved greatness on their own terms. It reassured a hierarchy: Europe as inventor, everyone else as inheritor. And that's why its death mattered far beyond genetics. The authors of the science paper wrote one quiet sentence that struck like a verdict. No trace of transatlantic ancestry has been detected in any population studied. In the cold precision of that line, centuries of bias began to unravel. Because when data refuses to obey ideology, it becomes a form of justice. Archaeology, for once, wasn't serving empire. It was serving correction. And correction, in this field, is rebellion. But even as the evidence settled, the reaction followed a familiar pattern. YouTube channels cried, "Cover up." Comment sections accused scientists of hiding proof. Blogs revived long-debunked photographs of European-looking skulls. The conspiracy industry pivoted from science to sentiment. If data didn't fit, it had to be political. This wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about ownership of truth. Because the myth's power was never archaeological, it was cultural. It offered a way for the modern West to keep its fingerprints on every human achievement. Even the peopling of continents had to pass through Europe. But DNA had no loyalty. It spoke only in probabilities and sequences, not in flags or ancestry claims. And what it said was simple. The Americas were populated by explorers from the East, not conquerors from the West. Humanity's story was global, not European. The 2025 studies did something else, too. They exposed how progress in science doesn't just change knowledge, it changes accountability. Every new test, every recalibration of data forces us to confront what we've built on unverified ground. Myths like the Solutrean hypothesis weren't harmless curiosities. They shaped policy, education, and prejudice. They justified the idea that colonization was simply returning home. Now that illusion is gone. What remains is humbler, but more honest. The first Americans were innovators, navigators, and survivors, descendants of a migration that spanned ice and generations, not conquest and inheritance. The Solutrean myth dies where all great lies die, under the microscope, not with anger, but with clarity. And for archaeology, 2025 wasn't just a year of discoveries. It was a year of accountability. Because when evidence finally outweighs ideology, what we lose in pride, we gain in truth. For centuries, the Great Pyramid of Giza has stood not only as a wonder, but as an accusation. How, people asked, could primitive hands move such colossal stones? Every era invented an answer worthy of its imagination. Some blamed lost technologies, others whispered of alien architects. But In 2025, a simple experiment silenced the myth more effectively than any theory ever could. The television series Expedition Unknown released footage of a modern stonemason, Frank Burgos, leading a small team in a desert test. Their goal was to move a limestone block identical to those used in the Great Pyramid. No machines, no cranes, no wheels, just ropes, wood, and sand. The result was not supernatural, it was physics. When the team poured water onto the sand ahead of the wooden sledge, the grains compacted, halving friction. The block glided forward, slow, steady, manageable. With 20 people pulling in rhythm, the stone advanced smoothly across the desert floor. The footage was striking not because it showed something new, but because it showed something ancient, hidden in plain sight. The trick had always been there, carved onto the walls of tombs and temples. Egyptian reliefs depict workers hauling colossal statues with men pouring water before the sledges. For years, scholars debated whether this was ritual or practicality. The 2025 experiment answered, it was engineering. The Egyptians were not dreamers of lost magic. They were masters of material science. This single demonstration shattered one of pseudo-archaeology's favorite pillars, the belief that the ancients couldn't possibly have been as smart as us. It revealed that disbelief, not the stones, was the heaviest thing modern minds carried. To 19th and 20th century explorers, the scale of Giza seemed impossible without modern technology. So, they filled the gap with fantasy. They imagined Atlanteans, vanished civilizations, or extraterrestrial tutors. Each myth shared one unspoken assumption, that ancient non-European peoples could not have built greatness unaided. The 2025 experiment exposed how prejudice had been hiding inside wonder all along. Because the Egyptians didn't just move stones, they moved assumptions. They built geometry before Euclid, logistics before cranes, and state labor systems before modern bureaucracy. Their achievements weren't miracles, they were management. Consider the numbers. Over 2 million blocks, most under 3 tons, placed with astonishing precision in just a few decades. It was not divine power, it was organized human effort. Laborers rotated seasonally, fed and paid by the state. Engineers measured with copper tools, leveled foundations with channels of water, and recorded each phase like accountants of eternity. The pyramid wasn't a monument to mystery, it was a testament to planning. The modern fascination with impossible ancient feats says less about them than it does about us. We distrust any past that doesn't flatter our superiority. So, we invent lost technologies to preserve it. But the more science we apply, the more myth collapses. And 2025 became the year skepticism finally bowed to respect. The researchers behind the experiment cautioned that this method only explained the limestone blocks, not the few giant granite slabs used deeper inside. Those heavier stones likely required a combination of ramps, levers, and lubricant surfaces, techniques well within the Egyptians' known repertoire. There was no mystery left, only precision born of patience. For archaeologists, the deeper significance was psychological. When we insist that ancient builders couldn't have done the work themselves, we're not protecting truth, we're protecting ego. We prefer mystery to humility. It's easier to imagine aliens than to admit that humans, thousands of years ago, were capable of genius under constraints we barely understand. The 2025 demonstration reframed the question entirely. Instead of asking how the Egyptians moved those stones, it asked why we ever doubted they could. Because disbelief is not scientific skepticism, it's cultural bias wearing a lab coat. Every pyramid theory that invoked lost civilizations carried a colonial echo. The assumption that intelligence must descend from somewhere else. But the truth of Giza, sweaty, calculated, and human, was far greater. It was proof that cooperation, mathematics, and discipline could achieve what superstition had claimed as impossible. When the footage aired, it didn't go viral because of spectacle. It went viral because it returned ownership to those who had been quietly underestimated for centuries. The Great Pyramid no longer needed rescue from myth. It only needed its builders to be believed. And perhaps that's the hardest correction archaeology ever makes. Believing that the ancients were never primitive, only patient. In the end, the stones didn't move by mystery. They moved by will, knowledge, and rhythm, the same forces that still build our world today. For almost a century, every retelling of Roman Britain carried one dramatic scene: the massacre at Maiden Castle, a desperate Celtic stronghold, Roman legions storming the gates, warriors cut down in a final act of defiance as civilization met savagery. It was blood, heroism, and empire distilled into one story, too cinematic to question. Until 2025, when the soil refused to perform. A team at Bournemouth University re-examined the burials that formed the heart of the tale. The so-called war cemetery, discovered in the 1930s by Mortimer Wheeler. He had described the site with the confidence of empire itself: skeletons bearing sword wounds, arrowheads near ribs, a young man with a spear still embedded in his spine. To Wheeler, this was proof. The Britons had fallen before Rome's disciplined might in 43 CE, victims of conquest and destiny. But science, like empire, moves on. Using modern radiocarbon dating, the 2025 team tested those same remains, bone by bone. The result shattered Wheeler's perfect tableau. The burials didn't belong to a single battle. They spanned nearly a century, from the late 1st century BCE into the middle of the 1st century CE. The wounds weren't uniform, the ages varied, the contexts clashed. These weren't fallen soldiers of one cataclysm. They were casualties of life, scattered feuds, punishments, accidents, perhaps even rituals. The massacre had never happened. The hill fort wasn't the stage of empire's final victory. It was already a relic by the time Rome arrived, partly abandoned, partly reused, its defenses crumbling into memory. Yet, for generations, that invented slaughter persisted, because it served a purpose. In the 1930s, Britain needed its archaeology to mirror its politics, heroic resistance giving way to orderly rule. The conquest had to feel inevitable, even merciful. The Maiden Castle story offered that comfort. It transformed conquest into closure, pain into progress. It let empire look noble in the mirror of prehistory. Wheeler's excavation reports read more like literature than science. The hill people died hard. His phrasing echoed in classrooms, documentaries, and museum plaques. Facts became fable. And for almost a century, no one questioned why the narrative sounded so tidy. Then, technology intervened. Radiocarbon dating had matured enough to detect the small differences that Wheeler's era couldn't. DNA, and isotopic analyses identified local variation among the dead. Not an army, not outsiders. Many were women and children. Their deaths didn't mark conquest. They marked community continuity. The silence that followed the 2025 report was telling. No grand rebuttals, no cinematic outrage. Just a quiet recognition that the Empire's story had been built, quite literally, on misdated bones. The implications were larger than one hill fort. They revealed how archaeology in its early age had been less about discovery and more about justification. Every trench was a moral metaphor, savage, defeated by civilization. And once that script was written, evidence merely played along. The new data demanded something harder: humility. Maiden Castle was not the site of a massacre, it was the site of misinterpretation. The bones hadn't lied. The historians had imagined too much. One of the researchers summarized it bluntly. There was violence, but not the violence we were looking for. That sentence said everything. It reminded us that even science carries its own theater. We project order onto chaos because disorder makes us uneasy. The notion of a single decisive battle fits our appetite for drama. A messy, prolonged story of decline and survival doesn't. But truth, like time, rarely collapses neatly into spectacle. The 2025 findings forced the public to face a larger question. If we invented one massacre to comfort our narrative, how many others survive untested? Because behind every myth of noble conquest hides a machinery of erasure, a need to package violence into meaning. Wheeler's Hill Fort wasn't an exception, it was a template. When the updated report was published, a small exhibit at the Dorset County Museum replaced its once glorious mural of Roman soldiers breaching the walls. The new display showed something quieter, a scatter of bones, each labelled with its calibrated date, each fragment speaking for a separate, smaller story. No banners, no legions, just people, living and dying across time. And perhaps that's where the truth of history actually lives. Not in the roar of armies, but in the intervals between them. The Roman massacre at Maiden Castle was never real, but the need for it was. Empires don't only conquer land, they conquer narrative. 2025 didn't just expose a misdated burial, it exhumed that habit. What was buried under those Dorset fields wasn't a battlefield, it was belief. For centuries, the ruins of Amarna, Pharaoh Akhenaten's short-lived capital, have carried a ghost story. According to legend, the city was destroyed not by politics or war, but by a devastating plague, a divine punishment, an invisible retribution that swept through temples and palaces, leaving Egypt's most heretical ruler buried in silence. It was a perfect explanation, moral, symmetrical, cinematic. And for over 100 years, historians repeated it without hesitation. But in 2025, a bioarchaeological study turned that story into dust. A joint team from Cairo and Uppsala re-examined hundreds of skeletal remains from Amarna's cemeteries. They searched for everything a plague should leave behind: irregular burial patterns, mass graves, skeletal markers of acute infection, demographic imbalance. What they found was nothing. No trace of epidemic trauma, no sign of sudden mortality. The burials were orderly, the age-at-death curve normal. People had lived, worked, and died under the usual stresses of urban life. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, but nothing resembling a catastrophic outbreak. The long-accepted plague of Akhetaten had never happened. For years, Egyptologists had used the idea of plague to explain the city's abandonment. It seemed logical. Akhenaten's reign was strange. He had upended the entire pantheon, abolishing Egypt's gods in favor of one deity, Aten, the sun disk. He closed temples, moved the capital, and rewrote theology into geometry. When Amarna was deserted after his death, scholars filled the vacuum with a convenient answer. The gods had punished him. But the 2025 evidence told another story, less moral, more human. Amarna didn't die from disease. It collapsed under the weight of ideology. The city had been built too fast, too grand, too fragile. It was a statement of faith turned into stone, a monument to a single man's belief that truth could be centralized like sunlight. But when Akhenaten died, the bureaucracy that sustained him evaporated. The priests of the old gods regained power, the treasury broke apart, and the political structure crumbled. The people simply left. In the stratigraphy of the site, the story is visible in layers. Unfinished walls, reused stones, household altars hidden in courtyards as quiet acts of defiance. Amarna didn't end in chaos, it faded. The plague narrative, it turns out, was our own way of making sense of failure, transforming a slow political collapse into a divine catastrophe. The researchers behind the 2025 study were careful with their language. They didn't mock earlier scholars, they dissected them. They showed how archaeology, like theology, sometimes prefers miracles over mechanisms. Because a plague fits the pattern of sin and punishment. A bureaucratic meltdown does not. The truth was harder to dramatize, but far more revealing. Akhenaten's revolution fell apart for the same reason most revolutions do. Not because it was cursed, but because it was unsustainable. And yet, the myth of the plague of Akhenaten persisted for more than a century because it gave the story moral closure. It turned complexity into consequence. It let history rhyme neatly with myth. The heretic king defied the gods, and the gods struck back. It's a narrative too elegant to die easily. The 2025 discovery forced historians to confront something deeper. How often our explanations for the past are less about evidence and more about the emotional needs of the present. We want justice in history. We want balance. If a king breaks the order, he must suffer. If a city rises too fast, it must burn. But the bones refused to cooperate. There were no mass pits, no sudden demographic dip, no biomarkers of plague in the DNA samples. Instead, the team found signs of malnutrition, heavy labor, and repetitive injuries. A workforce exhausted, not infected. The people of Amarna hadn't been wiped out. They had been worn down. That difference changes everything. It transforms the fall of Amarna from a myth of divine punishment into a lesson in political entropy. How belief, when weaponized as law, can consume its own foundation. And perhaps that's why the myth endured so long, because the truth was too familiar. A ruler who believed his vision could replace every system. A government that mistook devotion for stability. A city built on conviction rather than compromise. No plague could match the devastation of that logic. In the end, the 2025 study didn't just debunk a legend. It restored humanity to a story that had been moralized into myth. Amarna wasn't cursed, it was human. And that, paradoxically, is the harder story to tell. Because plague is a tragedy that absolves everyone. Politics is a tragedy that implicates us all. The bones of Amarna no longer whisper divine wrath. They whisper exhaustion, the quiet end of a dream too perfect to survive. For generations, the story of early medieval England was told in isolation. A land of pure Anglo-Saxon stock, sealed off from the outside world. Textbooks described it as homogeneous, northern, and insular. The implication was clear. England began as an island of sameness. But in 2025, a new genetic study shattered that illusion. Published in Antiquity, the research analyzed DNA from two individuals buried in 7th century graves, one in Kent, one in Dorset. The results upended everything the old narrative insisted upon. Both individuals carried clear traces of West African ancestry. The discovery was not a statistical quirk. The team double-checked contamination, sequencing methods, and comparative samples. The ancestry signals were genuine and ancient. Not from modern contact or trade, but from people who lived, died, and were buried in England during the early Anglo-Saxon period. The implications were immense, because these weren't visitors or slaves, they were members of the community. They were buried with care, in accordance with local custom, their graves indistinguishable from their neighbours. In other words, they weren't outsiders in death, and probably weren't in life. The study didn't claim that early England was cosmopolitan in the modern sense. It simply showed that even in the so-called Dark Ages, the island was connected by trade, migration, and the unpredictable tides of human movement. And yet, for centuries, the opposite idea had prevailed. Historians and nationalists alike clung to the notion of a closed island, a place where ancestry was pure and unbroken until invasion. The Anglo-Saxon past became a kind of racial sanctuary, a myth that underpinned both identity politics and empire. The 2025 evidence ripped through that fiction like light through stained glass. It didn't just alter a genetic map, it exposed the myth of purity itself. Because when DNA spoke, it revealed what ideology had buried. That movement, mixture, and adaptation are not exceptions in history, but its default condition. The reaction was immediate. Some welcomed the findings as proof that ancient Europe was far more interconnected than anyone imagined. Others recoiled. On fringe forums, accusations of tampering surfaced. "They're rewriting history," one commenter fumed, as if history had ever been static. But the science was unambiguous. The genomes showed West African signatures distinct and consistent, predating modern migrations by over a millennium. The ancestors of those individuals might have arrived through Mediterranean trade routes, or even earlier via Roman networks that never fully disappeared after the empire's fall. Archaeologists found material echoes to support that possibility. Mediterranean glass beads, African ivory, Byzantine coins scattered across early English graves. Evidence of exchange had always been there. We just chose to see isolation instead. Because isolation was useful. It fed the idea of origin, of a true England born clean of foreign touch, an island apart from the chaos of empire. The myth gave nationalism its archaeology, its pedigree, its reassurance. But the bones disagreed. The researchers' report was careful, almost poetic in restraint. These individuals remind us that early medieval England was not biologically sealed. Even distant ancestries found a place within its communities. That line undid centuries of selective storytelling. It also reframed migration itself. not as disruption, but as continuity. Movement wasn't the exception to civilization, it was the bloodstream of it. Every kingdom, every culture, every religion grew from the friction of contact. In that sense, those two skeletons were more than scientific data. They were political evidence, reminders that purity is not ancient, but invented. The discovery's timing made it hit harder. Across Europe, debates over identity, ancestry, and belonging were raging louder than ever. Politicians invoked history to draw borders in the mind. And then, two quiet graves in England spoke, whispering that those borders had never existed. For historians, the moment was humbling. It forced a rereading of the entire early medieval period. The migrations of Romans, North Africans, Near Eastern traders, and their descendants, who wove unnoticed into the genetic tapestry of the island. England, once imagined as isolated, was revealed as porous, a crossroads rather than a fortress. It wasn't diversity as ideology, it was diversity as reality. The soil had always been more honest than the story, because in the end, the past doesn't owe anyone a bloodline. It only offers evidence. And in 2025, that evidence said what politics could not. No civilization begins pure. No island stands alone. Those graves in Kent and Dorset didn't rewrite England's origins. They restored them. By 2025, no archaeological site had attracted more online mythology than Göbekli Tepe, the world's oldest known temple complex, rising from the hills of southeastern Turkey. It had been called proof of lost civilizations, evidence of aliens, even a gateway to Eden. But that year, the debate took a stranger turn. It began, as so many modern myths do, on YouTube. A creator named Jimmy Corsetti, known online as Bright Insight, accused archaeologists of hiding the truth. In his viral videos, he claimed that hundreds of olive trees had been planted atop Göbekli Tepe to prevent further excavation, a deliberate cover-up to keep the real discoveries buried. He linked it to the World Economic Forum, to elite suppression, to conspiracies about history's control. The story exploded. Millions watched. Comment sections filled with fury. For weeks, Save Göbekli Tepe trended across platforms. But behind the noise, the truth was much simpler and far more ordinary. Turkish archaeologists had been aware of the trees for years. They weren't a secret, and they certainly weren't planted by conspirators. In fact, the former landowners had placed them there back in 2004 to 2005, long before the government acquired the land for research. The roots were shallow, and while they posed some conservation risk, there was no hidden agenda. The 2025 controversy reached its climax when Corsetti claimed credit for their eventual removal, insisting that his campaign had forced officials to act. But records told another story. Göbekli Tepe's site management plan, publicly available on UNESCO's website since 2016, had already called for the gradual removal of the trees as part of long-term preservation. The decision wasn't secret, it was bureaucratic. When Turkish officials finally began relocating the trees in early 2025, they cited root stability, soil erosion, and infrastructure upgrades, not exposed truths. Yet the narrative online had already mutated beyond reach. Corsetti shared interviews and screenshots of Turkish media reports, arguing that archaeologists were lying. His proof? A mistranslation. In Turkish, site director Necmi Karol had explained that the trees could damage buried structures, a hypothetical warning. But when translated by an English news agency, it became, had begun to damage. That single verb shift, could to had, turned risk into evidence, and evidence into scandal. By the time the mistranslation was corrected, the outrage had already fossilized. The video had millions of views. The myth had gone global. What the Göbekli Tepe controversy revealed was no longer about archaeology. It was about the new economy of disbelief. In the age of social media, mystery isn't a byproduct of ignorance. It's a business model. Facts decay faster than engagement. Archaeologists release the scans. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, and geomagnetic surveys showing intact structures beneath the former olive grove. There was no damage, no missing ruins. But the retractions barely registered. The truth was quieter, slower, less profitable. For scientists, the episode felt familiar. Another reminder that in the digital age, myth regenerates faster than it can be buried. But for historians, it carried a deeper sting. A realization that the same pattern that once created ancient legends now fuels modern ones. The human instinct to fill silence with meaning hasn't changed. Only the tools have. Göbekli Tepe itself stood unchanged through all of it. 12,000-year-old T-pillars carved with foxes, vultures, and snakes. Their meanings still debated, their presence undeniable. The stones didn't need defenders, but the truth did. The archaeologists working on site responded not with outrage, but with documentation. They released updated conservation photos, open access reports, even drone footage showing the careful removal and replanting of each olive tree. Every frame contradicted the viral claims. Yet, the myth endured because outrage is addictive and nuance is not. One Turkish researcher described the frustration best. We spend decades preserving something built by people who never lied about what they made. And now we spend years defending it from people who invent lies about what we've preserved. That line captured the tragedy of 2025's digital archaeology. Evidence was no longer enough. To protect history, one had to compete with entertainment. Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known sanctuary on Earth, had become the newest battlefield in a war between verification and virality. And perhaps that's the real revelation, not about the past, but about us. We are still the same species that once turned eclipses into omens, bones into prophecies. Only now, our myths spread faster than our corrections. By the end of the year, official surveys confirmed the obvious. No damage to the site, no conspiracy, no cover-up. The trees had been relocated safely. The structures below remained pristine. But the internet had moved on, already chasing the next hidden truth to expose. The stones of Göbekli Tepe remained silent, as they always had. It was humanity, not history, that refused to learn. By the end of 2025, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Archaeology wasn't merely rewriting history, it was dismantling belief. 10 myths, 10 corrections, each one small in isolation, but together they exposed a quiet revolution, a world learning that truth doesn't need drama to matter. Cleopatra's lost sister turned out to be a boy. The Maya collapse dissolved into continuity. The band of holes became accounting, not aliens. The Great Pyramid proved human hands were enough. Maiden Castle lost its massacre. Amarna lost its plague. England lost its purity. and Göbekli Tepe lost its conspiracy. All that remained was evidence, unglamorous, relentless, incorruptible. In every case, the pattern was the same. A mystery became a myth. A myth became a market. And the market, over time, began to define what we called history. Until the data intervened. 2025 was the year archaeology reminded us that science is not the enemy of wonder, only of delusion. Because every correction wasn't an act of destruction, it was an act of rescue. Rescuing the past from the stories we forced upon it. And yet, there was something almost tragic about it. Each myth had survived for a reason. They weren't just errors. They were emotional economies. They gave meaning to chaos, order to uncertainty. The idea of a Maya apocalypse helped us believe that decline has a script. The Solutrean myth let empire pretend its fingerprints were ancient. The plague of Akhenaten turned political failure into divine symmetry. Even Göbekli Tepe's conspiracies offered believers what religion once did, a sense that someone, somewhere, was hiding the truth. Facts destroy those comforts, but they also offer something purer, responsibility. Because once the myths fall away, what's left isn't mystery, it's accountability. We can no longer blame gods for drought, fate for war, or curses for collapse. We have to confront systems, choices, and human error. And that's far harder to bear. That is why every revelation of 2025 felt both exhilarating and unsettling. It was not just the past being excavated, it was us. Archaeology, at its core, is an argument with time. It demands humility in a world that prefers certainty. Each new finding reminds us that truth is temporary, conditional, and often inconvenient. And yet, it's all we have that endures. When the skull once called Arsinoe's was revealed to be a child's, it reminded us that evidence doesn't care about symbolism. When the Maya collapse turned out to be resilience, it forced us to redefine greatness. When ancient England's DNA carried traces from across oceans, it proved that purity was a story, and diversity the default. When the Great Pyramid experiment showed wet sand and teamwork, it taught us that human ingenuity is not lost, it's just forgotten. Through it all, one question echoed. When does evidence become dangerous to belief? Maybe the answer is when belief becomes profitable. Because myths aren't accidents, they're systems. They endure, not because they are convincing, but because they are useful. They comfort identity, justify empire, and sell mystery in place of knowledge. That's what 2025 stripped bare. The year didn't make history less magical. It made us more honest about what the magic costs. When the excavations ended and the papers were published, the reaction wasn't triumph, but silence. The sound of certainty cracking. For every ancient truth revealed, a modern illusion died quietly beside it. Archaeologists didn't find new civilizations that year. They found us, in our projections, our biases, our need for closure. The ancient world, once again, had become a mirror. And in that reflection, we see the oldest pattern of all. Humanity invents myths to survive its own doubt. But in the end, only the evidence endures. Because ink fades, belief shifts, even empire crumbles. But the bones, they do not lie. They wait, they testify. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak.